The 30 Years' War, fought throughout Central Europe from 1618 to 1648 between Protestants and Catholics, laid the legal foundation for the nation-state. The war involved many nations of Europe, including many small German states, the Austrian Empire, Sweden, France, and Spain. Despite a brutal war, the Catholics were unable to overturn Protestantism. The treaty that ended the war, called the Peace of Westphalia, decreed that the sovereign ruler of a state had power over all elements of both the nation and the state, including religion. Thus, the modern idea of a sovereign nation-state was born. The Westphalia area of northwestern Germany gave its name to this treaty that ended the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in the history of Europe. The war, or rather series of connected wars, began in 1618 when the Austrian Habsburgs tried to impose Roman Catholicism on their Protestant subjects in Bohemia. It pitted Protestant against Catholic, the Holy Roman Empire against France, the German princes against the emperor and against each other, and France against the Habsburgs of Spain. The Swedes, the Danes, the Poles, the Russians, the Dutch, and the Swiss were all either dragged in or dived in. Make no mistake, religion was not the only issue. Commercial interests and rivalries played a part, as did pure power politics. The war was largely fought on German soil and reduced the country to desolation as hordes of mercenaries, left unpaid by their masters, lived off the land. Rapine, pillage, and famine stalked the countryside as armies marched about, plundering towns, villages, and farms as they went. The peace conference to end the war opened in Münster in December 1644. It involved no fewer than 194 states, from the biggest to the smallest, represented by 179 plenipotentiaries. A plenipotentiary is a person, especially usually a diplomat, who is invested with the full power of independent action on behalf of their government, which is typically in a foreign country. There were thousands of ancillary diplomats and support staff, all who had to be given housing, fed, and watered, and they did themselves well for close to 4 years despite famine in the country around. Presiding over the conference were the papal nuncio Fabio Chigi, the future Pope Alexander VII, and the Venetian ambassador. A papal nuncio, also known as an apostolic nuncio, is an ecclesiastical diplomat serving as an envoy or a permanent diplomatic representative of the Holy See or of the Pope to a state or to an international organization. The first 6 months were spent arguing about who was to sit where and who was to go into a room ahead of whom. The principal French and Spanish envoys never actually managed to meet at all because the correct protocol could never be agreed upon. A special postage system handled reams of letters between the envoys and their principals at a time when it took 10 days or more to send a communication from Münster to Paris or Vienna, and 20 days or more to Stockholm or Madrid. Slowly, deals were hammered out. Even then, it took almost 3 weeks just to organize the signing ceremony, which commenced at 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday, October 24th of 1648. The treaty gave the Swiss independence of Austria and the Netherlands independence of Spain. The German principalities secured their autonomy. Sweden gained territory and a payment in cash. Brandenburg and Bavaria made gains too. France acquired almost all of the Alsace-Lorraine region. The prospect of Roman Catholic reconquest of Europe, however, vanished forever. Protestantism was in the world to stay. The Piste of Westphalia consists of two different documents. First, the peace treaty of Osnabrück between the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation and Sweden, and the Treaty of Münster between the Holy Roman Empire and France. Okay, in addition to bringing an end to the war, the peace treaties also greatly influenced the constitution of the German Empire until its dissolution in 1806. It has been argued, although not without criticism, that the Peace of Westphalia was an important benchmark for the development of international law and international relations by bringing about a sovereignty-based international system, which is why we study it here today. What is at stake is how we ended up with a sovereign state system at all. Did everyone agree to it, or did it just happen by accident? And if the latter, when did the notion of sovereignty become widespread enough to justify saying that it was a characteristic of the system? This way of posing the questions makes it clear that sovereignty is taken here to mean the recognition of other states of the right to exclusive authority within a given territory, as opposed to the exercise of authority, both of which we defined, if you remember, at the start of this lecture. Defining sovereignty, in F.H. Hensley's words, as the idea that there is a final and absolute political authority in the political community, and no final and absolute authority exists elsewhere, is the only possible approach to explaining the role of a treaty in establishing the principle of sovereignty. Think of it this way. No piece of paper can ever establish exclusive authority in a given territory. Only administrative practice can do that. The most the paper can do is convince people that states ought to have exclusive territorial authority. By this definition, sovereignty is not a fact. Authority and power are facts. Sovereignty is an assumption about the location of that authority. So, as John Ruggie states, sovereignty signifies a form of legitimation. In a system of sovereign states, each recognizes the others as the final authorities within their given territories, and only they can be considered actors within the system. It is precisely on this ground that scholars have identified Westphalia with the origins of sovereignty as a formal statement of the principle of sovereignty, even if the practice was established earlier or later than 1648. Recent scholarship has seen state sovereignty as an historically novel method of organization that accompanied and was closely associated with other intellectual and cultural changes of the day. My arguments here, to the contrary, suggest that de facto sovereign states existed at a time when few statesmen had anything like the modern conception of sovereign equality as the founding notion of the international system. Thus, although it is possible to view the workings of a sovereign state system in the negotiations at the Congress of Westphalia, Europe had to wait much longer before this form of organization became conscious and formalized in an international law. The existence of sovereign states was, as in Kenneth Waltz's terms, a systematic effect, not itself predictable, based on the actions of any individual ruler, but a consequence of these actions when applied across the whole international system. Therefore, rather than being an idea that was historically constructed and then applied, sovereignty emerges as an historical fact that was gradually recognized by statesmen and eventually acknowledged as reality. This has been the method, to my madness, in striking all the way back to the Greek Empire for our foundations today. A key problem with studying the origins of sovereignty is that any ruler is likely to claim the sole authority to make decisions in their territory while unwilling to concede the same authority to any of his neighbors within theirs. The difficulty is not finding a ruler who considers himself to be sovereign, rather a group of rulers who recognize each other's sovereignty. This is illustrated by the concept of sovereignty understood in the Middle Ages, which is why we took such pains to develop all the different empires and all the different governing systems that existed in the Middle Ages. The idea of final authority was naturally given to the church, as God was the authority. And so his status was expressed on earth through the rival claims then of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor to represent him, to represent God. So the question at issue was not whether there was an earthly sovereign, but rather who served that function. In time, as both the Pope and the Emperor lost power, the authority of other monarchs, such as the kings of England, France, and the Ottomans, increased to the point that a multi-state system existed. Its existence did not challenge, however, the theory that authority flowed from God through a single earthly representative. In fact, the Pope put forward his most exalted claims in the 14th century as his power waned. Thus, although sovereign states existed, they did not recognize one another. Before multiple sovereign authorities could be recognized, the authority of the Pope and the Emperor had to be undermined conceptually, either by denying altogether the religious basis of secular authority, or that the Church's authority flowed through a single individual. So, the Piste of Westphalia is credited with accomplishing both goals. First, Pope Innocent X issued a brief called Zelo Domus Dei, condemning the Peace of Westphalia on account of its formal recognition of Protestantism in the empire. Not surprising. Secondly, the treaty contained a clause stipulating its own validity despite any objections coming from the Church. Oops. The peace might appear, therefore, to have terminated the Pope's claim to universal authority and confirmed the diplomatic independence of secular rulers. This was not the first time Protestantism in the empire had been recognized. However, that had happened 100 years earlier by the Treaty of Nuremberg in 1532. Thereafter, the papacy, while ignoring the treaty, had adopted a cautious strategy toward Protestantism in Germany. On one hand, the popes did not wish to formally recognize the schismatics, the people who had broken off, the Protestants. On the other hand, they hesitated to try to persuade the emperor to take a hard line because they recognized him to be the church's most important bulwark in the empire. The solution was silence, to support the emperor without acknowledging the very existence of the Protestants. The obvious counterargument in the Treaty of Westphalia is that if the German states were given the right to determine religion by the treaty, then they are inherently not sovereign. Because sovereignty, as we've defined again and again and again in this lecture, is being the absolute authority within your political sphere. So, if somebody outside is granting the German states the right to determine religion, then it effectively shoots a hole in the idea that they were sovereign, being given authority that should inherently be theirs if they were truly sovereign. You see what I mean? Napoleon Bonaparte. Oh, that name brings up images, doesn't it? He was a key figure in the development of the nation-state, too. Amid the chaos of the French Revolution in the late 18th century, most remaining medieval and feudal laws were overturned, and a truly national code was established. Similarly, a national military was created. Although not the only reason, France's status as a nation-state was a key factor in its ability to dominate feudal neighbors in Italy and Germany. So, thank you, Francis I. Napoleon's military victories also paved the way for the emergence of nation-states in the rest of Europe. In many places, the people rallied together as a nation in order to defeat Napoleon. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of conflicts fought between France, under the leadership of Napoleon Bonaparte, and a number of European nations between 1799 and 1815. They followed on from the War of the First Coalition of 1793 to 97, and engaged nearly all European nations in a bloody struggle, a struggle that also spilled over into Egypt and North and South America. During the wars, for during this period the fighting was not consistent, warfare was to change and to move towards modern warfare, leaving behind forever the idea of war as a sport of kings and moving towards the concept of total war as a nation against nation, the nations up in arms against each other. Weaponry also evolved, though at a much slower rate than the ideas of nations at arms and conscription. By the end of the period, most European armies had riflemen, and the British made the first large-scale use of rockets in a European war. The period started with bright uniforms, but by the end of the period, dark blue or green uniforms had become common for the skirmishes, which is the beginning of military camouflage. The period also saw the British Army, under the leadership of the Duke of Wellington, become the most renowned as the best in Europe. So, the first campaign of the Napoleonic Wars was called the War of the Second Coalition. With Bonaparte absent in Egypt, fighting the British, a new coalition formed against the French in 1798. This consisted of Russia, Great Britain, Austria, Portugal, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Naples. The fighting took place mainly in northern Italy and Switzerland, with the Russians being successful at first in doing the damage done by Napoleon's victories in Italy. The French defeated the Russians, who pulled out of the coalition. Bonaparte offered a separate peace, but the coalition refused, and in 1800 he crossed the Alps and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in 1800. Other French victories followed, and soon it was only the British who remained to stand against the French. After a failed attack in Holland, Britain made peace in 1802, but this was not to last long. In 1805, the War of the Third Coalition broke out, with Britain now joined by Russia, Austria, and Sweden. Napoleon defeated the Austrians at Ulm in 1805, and finally at Austerlitz in 1805, known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Once again, the coalition formed this time with Prussia, but without Austria. Napoleon quickly moved against the Prussians and crushed them at the Battle of Jena in 1806. By 1808, Napoleon was the master of all Europe, but he was now to begin a series of mistakes that would quickly lead to his defeat. Dethroning King Charles IV of Spain, he made his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, king, causing a revolt and what was to be known as a guerrilla war in Spain. During the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1813, these Spanish guerrillas, aided by British troops under Wellington and their Portuguese allies, drove the French out, eventually invading southern France. There's a method to my madness here, folks. Please don't think that I'm going on and on about these names of these battles, etc. I want to call your attention to the alliances, the British and the French and the Spanish and the Russians and the Prussians and the French, and who's allying with whom, for what purposes, at what ends, at what times, and you get the idea, right? Because it's this balance of power, these interlocking alliances, that is going to cause all the troubles that are going to result in World War I. So bear with me. There's a method to my madness. With large numbers of his troops tied down in Spain, Napoleon decided to invade Russia in 1812 with an army of 500,000 men. And although he defeated the Russians at the Battle of Borodino in 1812, and he actually took Moscow, he was forced to retreat due to the weather, costing him most of his army and marking the beginning of the end. So if you're familiar with Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, this is where that fits in. So imagine, surrounded by enemies on all sides, with his best troops dead, Napoleon was forced to abdicate in 1814. As the members of the Fifth Coalition decided the fate of Europe, Napoleon staged a daring return to power and tried to reverse the outcome of the war at the Battle of Waterloo. We know that. June 18, 1815, Waterloo was a bloody battle which saw his remaining elite guard destroyed and Napoleon exiled to St. Helena, from which he was never to return, marking the end of Napoleon and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but which brings us to the concert of Europe. Our next examination is for the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna was a diplomatic peace conference that sought to end the Napoleonic Wars. It created what's called the Final Act, which sounds a little misleading. It was actually an omnibus treaty that contained many other smaller treaties into one large bundle called the Final Act, signed on June 9th, 1815, by statesmen who have been frequently compared to the statesmen of 1914. The protagonists at the Congress of Vienna are some really heavy hitters. You have, first and foremost, Tsar Alexander of Russia himself attending, British Foreign Secretary Robert Stewart, who is also Viscount Castlereagh, that was his title. Herein we're just going to be simply referring to him as Castlereagh, but he was the British Foreign Secretary. You have Prince Clemens von Metternich, herein known as simply Metternich, who was the Austrian representative. You have the representative of Prussia in Prussian Prime Minister Karl August von Hindenburg. You have France's Minister of Foreign Affairs, a very famous name, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, otherwise known as Talleyrand, and many others of their generation. This list of notable personalities were far from blind to the horrors of revolution or of war. They were members of a privileged and landed aristocracy, and they were nourished in their youths by the privileges of the Ancien Regime and the heady ideals of the Enlightenment. As described in his excellent article, No Sleepwalkers, the Men of 1814, in the Journal of Modern European History, Mark Jarrett suggests that they had known Europe before the French Revolution and had also experienced the optimism and the chaos of the Revolution in their youths. Although born into the nobility, the men of 1814 and 1815 were far from idle aristocrats. They had achieved their high positions in policy-making circles through their own talents and perseverance. Each of the leading statesmen at Vienna had, in fact, encountered and overcome notable personal and political reverses. This was partly a byproduct of the long struggle with Napoleon, in which everyone had been on the losing side at one time or another. Castlereagh, for example, had been held responsible for the fiasco at Walcheren and had been ousted from the British cabinet. Metternich's advice had been rejected in 1809. His country had been defeated at Wagram, and he had witnessed the occupation of Vienna by French forces. Talleyrand had been disgraced and humiliated by Napoleon, while Tsar Alexander had experienced the defeat at Austerlitz and had been forced to submit to Napoleon's conditions at Tilsit. Worse still, in the dark days of 1812, he had suffered the French invasion of Russia and the burning of Moscow. What did these men learn from their struggles and their privations? One might suppose that they had become vengeful and unforgiving. Instead, their wartime experiences fostered a sense of realism and pragmatism. Above all else, they learned the necessity of frequent communication, developed a willingness to consider views from other vantage points, and gained an appreciation for the benefits of cooperation and moderation. These qualities, which had held the alliance together in the final campaign, were now carried over into peacetime. Old and New World met in the autumn of 1814 as these notable statesmen gathered at the Congress of Vienna. Were they great architects? Did they create a new world order, or simply restore the old? The answer there lies somewhere in between. The French Revolution had constituted a profound break with the past. These men of 1814, having vanquished Napoleon and dissolved his empire, were faced with the task of redrawing the map of Europe, an opportunity and a challenge unprecedented in modern history. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars had torn asunder the fabric of the Ancien Regime. Under Napoleon's ruthless hand, new states had been formed and destroyed at dizzying speed. But now this game of musical chairs in play for 2 decades was about to cease. Where were the new frontiers of Europe to be drawn? One could begin, as the Allies did, with the frontiers of France. While the statesmen of 1814 have often been complimented on their foresight in inviting France to the Congress, the arrangements with France had already been concluded before in the first Peace of Paris. Even this treaty, however, was a negotiated settlement and not a coerced dictate. in the sense of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 that we are going to look at in a moment. This had less to do with French Talleyrand's diplomatic skill than with the views of the Allied statesmen on the nature of the enemy. That enemy, they believed, was the French Revolution, and they saw Napoleon as the military face of that primordial force. The Bourbon King of France was their natural ally, and they therefore did not seek a punitive treaty that would undermine his authority. After France, the men of 1814 turned to the Netherlands. As Nieck van Sass has shown, the future of the Netherlands featured prominently in their thinking. After all, it was fear of French control that had first brought the British into the war in 1793. As early as 1795, the British Foreign Secretary, then Lord Grenville, had proposed that the Netherlands be strengthened by the addition of Belgium. In 1805, Prime Minister Pitt had called for dividing Belgium between Holland and Prussia in order to create new barriers against French aggression. Instead, in 1806, Napoleon reduced the Netherlands to the puppet kingdom of Holland, ruled by, oh that's right, his brother, Louis Bonaparte, and then directly annexed the Netherlands to France 4 years later. Only in 1813 was Prince William of Orange able to return to the Netherlands after French troops had finally withdrawn. Meanwhile, Castlereagh carried Pitt's master plan with him when he traveled to the continent in December of 1813. In the first Peace of Paris, it was agreed that Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands should be united. The decision to establish a monarchy, on the other hand, was taken solely on the initiative of William of Orange. Castlereagh did not wish to dictate the internal arrangements of the Netherlands, although he was overjoyed with the results. At the same time, the British refused to return all of the former Dutch colonies, some of which they kept as strategic posts for their growing empire. The reorganization of Central Europe was far more problematic. The Tsar had set out to right the wrongs of his grandmother, Catherine the Great, by restoring Poland, which had been effaced from the map by the partitions of 1772. However, to placate the Russian nobility, the Tsar also had to guarantee that the new Poland would not be a threat to Russia, a trick he neatly pulled off by proposing a kingdom of Poland with himself as king. In doing so, he restored Polish territorial integrity and institutions, really without granting the Poles their full independence. At the same time, in order to secure Prussian adherence to the final coalition against Napoleon, Tsar Alexander had previously agreed to restore Prussia to its pre-1806 proportions. The Tsar proposed to compensate Prussia for its Polish losses with the acquisition of the Kingdom of Saxony. Further complicating matters, to entice the Austrians to join the Allied coalition, the Tsar had promised in June of 1813 that Poland would be repartitioned. The subsequent controversy at the Congress of Vienna over the Tsar's Polish-Saxon plan would doubtless have become far more acrimonious had it not been for the close cooperation that had developed between the Allied leaders during the final months of the campaign against Napoleon. Both Metternich and Castlereagh, remember Metternich is Austrian, Castlereagh is British, both Metternich and Castlereagh were skeptical and viewed the Russian Tsar's Polish-Saxon scheme as merely a new form of Russian aggrandizement. Yet, despite some loud saber-rattling, the Allies managed to avoid a renewal of armed conflict. In an elaborate minuet, in an elaborate dance, Prussia first cooperated with Russia, then acted in concert with Austria, and then in Britain, and finally gravitated back to Russia. These oscillations can be explained in part by Prussian interests, but more so by the different perspectives of Hardenberg and his sovereign, Frederick William III. In the end, the Tsar succeeded in taking most of Poland. Yet, Castlereagh and Metternich were eventually proven right in thinking that the Poles would be unable to maintain their autonomy in such a setting. So, while Poland remained divided, Germany was simplified, and its 39 separate states associated together in a loose confederation called the Deutschbund. Prussia gained 2/5 of Saxonies as well as new territories to the west. The Netherlands and Hanover contributed to the final settlement by making further territorial cessions to Prussia. In Italy, too, the men of 1814 faced the task of reconstruction. Here again, Napoleon had replaced traditional boundaries with a bewildering succession of new states. The statesmen at Vienna could not turn back the clock, but they placed Habsburg princes in several of the central Italian principalities, while strengthening the kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia as another barrier state cradling France. At Vienna, one key issue was whether to topple Napoleon's brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, from the throne of Naples. Austria had signed a treaty with Murat in the final stages of the 1814 campaign, yet Louis XVIII was determined to remove him and to return the Neapolitan, or Naples, Bourbons, his cousins, to the throne. Murat solved the problem by allying with Napoleon during the 100 Days. Not all the decisions at Vienna were confined to territorial arrangements. The plenipotentiaries guaranteed the neutrality of Switzerland and discussed protections for German Jews and the abolition of the slave trade. They also established new rules for diplomatic precedence and created the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine River in Germany. A single treaty, this Vienna Final Act that I referred to, created a new body of public law for Europe. As I referred to before, having been raised in the Age of Enlightenment and having lived through the French Revolution, the men of 1815, especially Tsar Alexander, were to some extent moderate constitutionalists. New constitutions were introduced in the southern German states, in France, in Finland, Poland, Norway, and the Netherlands. Frederick William III of Prussia announced that he would grant his subjects a constitution. Castlereagh recommended to Louis XVIII, the restored King of France from 1814 to 1824, that he become a true constitutional monarch on the British model. And the Tsar secretly ordered Nicholas Novosiltsev to draw up a constitution for Russia. Yet, these statesmen also remained firm advocates of monarchical authority and hereditary privilege. Their plans were not liberal enough to satisfy the yearnings of those seeking a true sharing of power. Faced with mounting signs of restiveness, the European rulers and their statesmen became increasingly conservative after 1819. In Latin America, revolutions were already in progress. Spain's attempts to obtain the assistance of the great powers to suppress them were foiled by the British. In the German states, Metternich succeeded in imposing the Carlsbad decrees, restricting freedom of the press and of student societies. At nearly the same time, Castlereagh introduced 6 acts in the British House of Commons, while the Tsar authorized his brother to take repressive measures in Poland. In fact, the great European alliance was soon deployed to restore the plenitude of power to the crown heads of Spain, Naples, and Piedmont, absolute rulers who, having opposed reform, became the victims of quasi-popular revolutions led by junior officers of their own military establishments. Russia, Austria, and Prussia propagated general principles of counter-revolution in 1820. Castlereagh could not openly commit British policy to such objectives, although he secretly sympathized with the Continental powers. This disagreement led to a visible rift in the alliance. The British and the Russians had never construed the alliance in quite the same light. The Russians had always seen it as an embryonic world government, while the British had mainly viewed it as a convenient forum for exchanging information and watching over France. If the Congress system, in its original sense, had survived, European history might have been far different. In its purest form, however, the system only lasted really until 1823. After the suicide of Castlereagh, France's unilateral intervention in Spain, and the death of Tsar Alexander, modern history's first conscious effort to create a method of global governance based on multilateral interstate international cooperation seems to have failed. But rather than disappear altogether, the Congress system evolved into what's called the Concert of Europe, which were ambassadorial conferences that continued to handle crises like the Belgian Revolution in the 1830s, and there existed continuing respect for the territorial settlement at Vienna, although with periodic readjustments. Most importantly, a total war involving all the great powers at once was avoided for an entire century. In this sense, the system maintained the peace, making possible, as Paul Schroeder has pointed out, a period of unprecedented intellectual and technological innovation, as well as the global expansion of European culture and power, often with brutal consequences in non-European lands. Should the Vienna settlement and Congress system therefore be held accountable for the acceleration of European imperial expansion later in the century? A question raised at several recent conferences marking the bicentennial of this conference. 20 years ago, Edward Ingram argued that stability within Europe caused the powers to project their bellicosity outwards. More recently, scholars have pointed to the global dualism in which civilized norms were applied inside Europe, but a bloody free-for-all reigned elsewhere. And it's true enough that Metternich exhibited just such callousness or incomprehension when in 1821 he wrote that whether 300,000 or 400,000 are hanged, slaughtered, or impaled in the Ottoman Empire, it scarcely matters. Wow. However, although European statesmen treated native peoples outside of Europe with a considerable degree of ruthlessness, this was not a new phenomenon in 1814. If anything, the Congress statesmen showed greater sympathy than their predecessors for the rest of humanity, as demonstrated by their efforts against the slave trade. And developments later in the century, such as the corrosive effects of European contacts with indigenous societies in Africa and Asia and the Pacific, Technological advances and the rise of new ideologies like social Darwinism played a greater role in promoting imperialism than the Vienna settlement or the Congress system, even though the stability they created certainly helped. The Congress system left another quite unexpected legacy. In 1918, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points called for a general association of nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. Ironically, almost all the same formula that had been raised and rejected by the great powers in the heated debates of 1818. Although Wilson opposed what he called the old diplomacy, British leaders, in fact, looked to the operation of the Congress system for guidance in designing the new League of Nations, post-World War I, and reflecting Wilson's 14 points that we're going to address in a few minutes. In the end, the Executive Council of the League of Nations was composed of the Allied great powers in almost exact imitation of the Congress system. In 1945, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, this was turned into the United Nations Security Council, whose veto-yielding permanent members were the victors of World War II, thus excluding Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil. The Congress system also provided the precedent for all later international summit conferences, personal meetings of heads of state and foreign ministers, such as the G7 of today. In sum, the generation of 1814 can hardly be maligned as sleepwalkers. They were acutely aware of the high stakes being played. They stood astride two worlds, between the turbulence of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and the stability of the long 19th century, which, ostensibly, they helped create. As architects, they were highly conscious of laying a foundation for the future. The great military powers of the continent, who have triumphed in the wars, wrote Castlereagh to the Tsar during the Congress of Vienna, should recollect they avowedly fought for their own liberties and for those of the rest of Europe, and not for an extension of their dominions. If the Allied powers act liberally towards each other and indulgently to other states, they may look forward to crown a glorious war by a solid and lasting peace. And posterity will revere their names, not only for having delivered by their arms the world from a tyrant and a conqueror, but for having restored the balance of power that would hold fast until the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, in modern-day Bosnia-Herzegovina, starting World War I. Following the Congress of Vienna and the birth of the Concert of Europe, a widespread realignment occurred in 1848 that bears our conversation today. The revolutions of 1848, known in some countries as the Springtime of the Peoples, or the Spring of Nations, were a series of political upheavals throughout Europe in 1848. It remains the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history. The revolutions were essentially democratic and liberal in nature, with the aim of removing the old monarchical structures and creating independent nation-states. The revolutions spread across Europe after initial revolution began in France in February 1848. Over 50 countries were affected, but with no significant coordination or cooperation among their respective revolutionaries. Some of the major contributing factors were widespread dissatisfaction with political leadership, demands for more participation in government and democracy, demands for freedom of the press, and other demands made by the working class, the upsurge of nationalism, and the regrouping of established government forces. The uprisings were led by temporary coalitions of reformers, the middle classes, otherwise the bourgeoisie, and workers. However, the coalition did not hold together for long. Many of the revolutions were quickly suppressed. Tens of thousands of people were killed, and many more were forced into exile. Significant lasting reforms included the abolition of serfdom in Austria and Hungary, the end of absolute monarchy in Denmark, and the introduction of representative democracy in the Netherlands. The revolutions were most important in France, the Netherlands, Italy, the Austrian Empire, and the states of the German Confederation. This resulted in the evolution of Realpolitik. Realpolitik is a German word referring to politics-driven, practical, or pragmatic concerns rather than ideological ones. Basically, it is the idea that in politics, compromise is often necessary, and that pragmatism, rather than ideology, should be a guiding force. Realpolitik is most commonly associated with German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was a master statesman and used Realpolitik extensively and with tremendous success. Bismarck and Realpolitik are almost intertwined to those familiar with 19th century European history. They're kind of like Bert and Ernie, they just go together. Bismarck was a driving force behind the creation of a unified German nation-state in 1871, and he used Realpolitik to accomplish this. He is often attributed this quote, "Politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the art of the next best." In perfect summary, Realpolitik. This quote stresses that in politics, compromises, as I say, are sometimes necessary, and that while a first choice might be ideal and is really what you'd rather aim for, it is usually the second best option that's usually attainable through negotiation. So even though Bismarck, as I suggested, is the figure everyone associates with the term Realpolitik, he didn't actually coin the term. It was coined in 1853 by Ludwig von Rothschild, a German journalist and politician himself, in his book Grundsätze der Realpolitik. One could argue, too, that Machiavelli inhabited the ideal of Realpolitik as well. As I say, in 1848, revolution spread through Europe. These democratic revolutions were largely unsuccessful, but nevertheless they helped foster the growth of nationalism and liberalism. In the aftermath of revolution, Austrian diplomat Metternich, we remember him, also adopted the principle of Realpolitik and used it to keep revolution at bay. Although Metternich was a conservative, he was willing to negotiate with the liberals. He made compromises with them, his conservative government stable and in control, but that also satisfied liberals and prevented them from engaging in further revolution.